All right, so are you ready to dive into this whole Trump trade thing?
Yeah.
Trying to figure out which sectors are going to take off now that he's back in the White House? Well, you've come to the right place. We're going deep, deep, deep into how the markets are reacting to the 2024 election. And we've got two really interesting articles here, one from Morningstar and another from Bloomberg Linea. They're just packed with predictions from analysts. But we're not just going to scratch the surface here. We're going to figure out why these market shifts are happening and what they tell us about the big economic picture.
Absolutely.
And you know what? We've got expert speaker here to help us really unpack it all.
I'm excited to dig in.
Me too. Okay, so one thing that both articles jump on right away is how the markets reacted immediately when Trump won. It was a surge in stocks across the board.
Yeah.
I mean, Morningstar even calls it a full-blown Trump trade.
It is fascinating to see this play out, especially when you consider the historical context. Republican presidencies have often been seen as good for the markets.
Yeah, makes sense.
And that perception is really rooted in their association with certain policies, like deregulation, tax cuts, and just a generally business-friendly approach.
Okay, I can see that. But here's where things get a little more interesting. Morningstar also points out that bond yields are going up, which is a sign that people are worried about inflation.
Right.
So could those same policies, the tax cuts, the deregulation, also be contributing to that inflation worry?
You've hit on a key point there. Market trends often have a ripple effect. So those tax cuts and deregulation, they might stimulate the economy in the short term, but they can also lead to more spending, which could lead to inflation down the line.
So it's a bit of a balancing act.
Exactly. It's a complex dance. And that's what makes analyzing these trends so fascinating. There are always multiple forces at play, each with its own potential consequences.
Okay, well, let's get into some specifics then. Both Morningstar and Bloomberg Linea single out the financial sector as like an early celebrator of Trump's win.
Uh-huh.
The Morningstar U.S. Financial Services Index shot up almost 6.3% right after the election, with big banks like J.P. Morgan Chase and Bank of America leading the charge.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you think about the historical relationship between banks and Republican administrations, banks generally do really well when there's less regulation.
Yeah.
It reduces their compliance burden and gives them more flexibility to operate.
Makes sense.
And we can't forget about the impact of higher long-term interest rates,
Right.
which are a likely outcome of Trump's policies.
Right. Morningstar specifically mentioned that. So how do higher interest rates translate into good news for banks?
Well, think about it this way. Banks make money by lending money at higher rates than they borrow it at. So in a higher interest rate environment, that difference between borrowing and lending rates gets bigger, boosting their profits.
So they're making more money on each loan.
Exactly.
Okay, so it seems like banks are in a pretty good spot, at least in the short term. But what about the long game? Are there any potential downsides we should be watching out for?
That's a great question, and it's definitely one we should keep in mind. While the initial reaction might be positive, the long-term effects of these policies on the financial sector and the economy as a whole could be quite different.
Like what?
Well, think about risks like asset bubbles on sustainable lending practices, even a resurgence of the too-big-to-fail problem.
Okay, so plenty to keep an eye on there. All right, let's switch gears for a minute and talk about energy. Both sources point to traditional energy companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron as expecting a pretty good run with Trump back in charge. Morningstar even saw a big jump in their energy index right after the election.
This reaction is directly related to Trump's stance on environmental regulations. He's pretty skeptical about electric vehicles and renewable energy, and he signaled he might roll back some of those policies. So fossil fuel companies are anticipating a more favorable environment under his leadership.
So while those companies are celebrating, what about the clean energy folks? Did the articles say anything about how they're reacting to all this?
Yeah, both sources point out that Trump's policies could really throw a wrench in the progress made towards clean energy. Bloomberg Linea specifically mentions a potential slowdown in the adoption of electric vehicles.
Okay.
And Morningstar says that solar companies took a hit right after the election.
Sounds like a lot of uncertainty swirling around clean energy right now. Okay, let's talk tech. I know everyone's watching that closely. The articles mention that tech stocks didn't jump as high as financials or energy, but they still went up after the election. Why is that?
Well, Morningstar says it's because people are anticipating lower corporate taxes, which would be huge for those big tech giants.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But Bloomberg Linea throws in an interesting twist.
Ooh, I like a good twist. Tell me more.
They think that small and mid-cap tech companies might actually benefit more from Trump's pro-business policies. They argue that these smaller companies have more potential for rapid growth and expansion.
Interesting. So they're in a good position to take advantage of that business-friendly environment.
Exactly. They see it as a potential opportunity.
Okay, so it's not as simple as Trump is good for tech or Trump is bad for tech.
Right. It's much more nuanced than that. Different parts of the tech sector are likely to be impacted differently depending on their size, focus, and business models.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this Trump trade is less about making sweeping statements and more about understanding the subtleties within each sector.
Exactly. It's about connecting the dots, understanding how political decisions, market dynamics, and individual company strategies all interact. And that's what we're here to help you do.
Well, Bloomberg Linea definitely threw in some surprises when they talked about who might benefit from Trump's win. For example, pharmaceutical companies. I wouldn't have thought of that right away.
Yeah, it's a fascinating connection. It really speaks to those complexities we're talking about. Bloomberg Linea's prediction is based on Trump's emphasis on domestic production, especially for essential things.
Okay.
They think there's potential for more pharmaceuticals to be made here in the U.S., which would obviously be great for U.S.-based pharma companies.
Makes sense. But what about this whole thing with prison companies potentially benefiting? That one really caught my attention.
Yeah, it's a controversial angle for sure. Bloomberg Linea suggests that Trump's policies could lead to a greater reliance on private prisons, just like we saw during his first term. It's a stark reminder that market reactions aren't always black and white. They often reflect deeper societal trends and policy choices that have ripple effects we need to consider.
It really makes you think about the bigger picture.
Hmm.
Okay, so we've got banks potentially celebrating oil and gas, breathing a sigh of relief, clean energy facing uncertainty, and tech companies navigating a mixed bag. What else is on the horizon?
Well, Bloomberg Linea throws out a pretty thought-provoking what if. What if Trump actually manages to bring peace to the Middle East and de-escalate the conflict in Ukraine?
Okay, now that would be a game changer. But how would that impact the markets?
They suggest that construction companies could see a major boom from all the rebuilding that would need to happen. And at the same time, arms manufacturers might see a decline. It's all very speculative, of course. But it does raise an important point about how interconnected geopolitics and markets really are. If Trump's foreign policy goes in an unexpected direction, it could have major ripple effects across all sorts of sectors.
It's a reminder that we're not just looking at economic data in a vacuum. We have to consider the global political landscape and how that might influence market trends.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this whole Trump trade analysis so fascinating. It's not just about crunching numbers and looking at historical patterns. It's about understanding human behavior, political motivations, and the intricate interplay of local and global forces.
All right, so we've laid out the initial reactions, the potential winners and losers, and some of the key factors driving these trends. Where do we go from here?
Well, the next step is to really dig into these sectors, explore those nuances and potential risks that lie beneath the surface. Remember, market trends are like icebergs. What you see on the surface is just a small part of the story. It's the hidden depths that really matter.
And that's where you come in, dear listener. We've given you the starting point, the initial lay of the land. Now it's your turn to dive deeper, to ask those critical questions, and to form your own conclusions about the potential impacts of this Trump trade. What stands out to you as the most significant takeaway from this initial analysis? What further questions are bubbling up in your mind? Remember, the Trump trade story is just beginning, and it's one you'll want to follow closely.
It's going to be a fascinating ride.
All right, ready to keep digging?
Absolutely. Let's continue our deep dive and see what other insights we can uncover.
Okay, so we've talked about those initial market reactions, and we've highlighted some potential winners and losers. But I'm really curious to dig into some of those broader themes that keep popping up in these articles, like this whole idea of shifting towards more domestic production.
Yeah, that's a great observation. It's definitely a recurring theme in both the Morningstar and Bloomberg Linea pieces. We see it in Trump's stance on pharmaceuticals, the potential impact on small and mid-cap tech companies, and even the speculation about construction companies benefiting from those hypothetical peace deals.
Right. It seems like Trump's economic vision is laser-focused on bringing manufacturing jobs back and reducing our dependence on foreign goods. It's not just about boosting specific sectors. It's about, reshaping the entire economic landscape.
Exactly. And that shift towards domestic production could trigger some pretty big changes in global trade and international relations. If the U.S. becomes more inward focused, how are other countries going to react? Will we see a rise in protectionism globally? These are questions we need to be asking.
Those are some big questions for sure. It seems like this Trump trade is less about picking individual stocks and more about understanding a fundamental shift in economic philosophy.
That's a very insightful point, and it's this underlying philosophy that we need to grasp to really understand the potential consequences of the Trump trade. What are the long-term implications of a more protectionist approach? How does this impact global supply chains and international cooperation? These are questions that investors, policymakers, and even just regular people need to be grappling with.
So it's not just about playing the stock market. It's about understanding the bigger picture, the forces that are shaping the global economy.
Absolutely. Investment decisions should be based on a deep understanding of the political and economic landscape, not just short-term market fluctuations. We need to be thinking long-term about the ripple effects of these policies and how they'll impact everything from international trade to social equity.
It seems like responsible investing isn't just about maximizing returns. It's about aligning your investments with your values and understanding the bigger picture.
You got it. And that's what this deep dive is all about, giving you the knowledge and tools to do just that, to think critically, ask the right questions, and make informed decisions that align with your values and how you see the world.
This is where things get really interesting for me. It's not just about what happens here in the U.S. It's about how this Trump trade might influence the global economy. We're all connected after all.
That's a crucial point. The U.S. economy is deeply intertwined with the rest of the world, so any major policy changes here are going to have repercussions far beyond our borders. Both Morningstar and Bloomberg Linea touch on this, with discussions of potential trade wars, the impact on emerging markets, and even the implications for global energy production.
It's a reminder that this isn't just a domestic economic story. It's a global narrative that's still being written. And a story with potentially huge consequences for everyone, no matter where they live.
Exactly. The Trump trade isn't just an economic phenomenon. It's a global event that will impact the lives and livelihoods of people around the world. And it's a story that we're all participating in one way or another.
Okay, so how do we even begin to make sense of all this? It seems like the Trump trade is this tangled web of trends, potential consequences, and things we just don't know yet.
That's the challenge and the beauty of analyzing complex systems. There are no simple answers, no guarantees. It's about asking the right questions, considering multiple perspectives, and being open to unexpected twists and turns.
So instead of trying to predict the future with certainty, it's more about developing a way to understand the forces at work and imagining different scenarios that could play out.
Exactly. And that's why this deep dive is so valuable. It's not about giving you a step-by-step guide. It's about giving you the tools and knowledge to navigate this complex terrain. It's about developing a critical eye, a sense of curiosity, and a willingness to question everything.
And maybe most importantly, it's about understanding that the Trump trade isn't some abstract thing. It's something that will have real consequences for people's lives, their businesses, and their communities.
Absolutely. It's about connecting those market trends to the human stories behind them. For example, we talked about the potential for more pharmaceuticals being made here in the U.S. But what does that actually mean for patients who need affordable medication? How will it impact healthcare costs and access to those essential treatments? These are the types of questions we need to be asking.
Right. It's easy to get lost in the numbers and forget that there are real people whose lives are affected by these trends.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to look at the big picture, to consider the human side of these economic changes. Economics isn't just about profits and losses. It's about people's lives, their well-being, and their opportunities.
So as we keep unpacking this Trump trade, let's keep those human stories in mind. Let's connect those economic trends to the real experiences of people and communities.
Absolutely. Let's remember that behind every stock ticker, every market index are real people, real businesses, and real communities whose lives are being shaped by these global forces.
Okay, I'm ready to keep digging. What else did those articles tell us about potential winners and losers in this new economic landscape?
Let's look at some specific sectors they highlighted, paying attention to the details and the risks that go with each one. Let's start with the financial sector, which seems like the most obvious winner under Trump.
Yeah, both sources pointed to deregulation of the financial industry as a key driver of growth. It could potentially lead to increased lending, higher profits for banks, and a boost to the stock market overall.
Exactly. But Morningstar also mentions the risks that come with deregulation, like increased systemic risk and the possibility of another financial crisis.
That's a valid concern. Deregulation might stimulate the economy in the short term, but it can also create an environment where people take too much risk, which could lead to long-term instability.
It's a balancing act. On the one hand, you have the possibility of growth and increased profits, but on the other hand, you run the risk of creating a system that's vulnerable to collapse, and the consequences of that would be felt far beyond Wall Street.
So even though the financial sector seems like it's in a good position under Trump, There are some big risks that investors and policymakers need to be aware of. It's not just about celebrating potential gains. It's about understanding the risks and making sure the whole system stays stable and resilient.
Exactly. Responsible economic policy needs a holistic view, one that considers both the good and the bad and tries to create a system that works for everyone, not just a few.
Okay, let's move on to energy. We talked about how traditional energy companies are probably going to benefit from Trump's policies. What about renewable energy? How might this shift impact that sector?
That's a great question and one that's causing a lot of debate. Both articles suggest that renewable energy could face some tough times under Trump. His skepticism about climate change and support for fossil fuels could mean less government help for renewables, which could slow down the sector's growth.
So while oil and gas might be celebrating, solar and wind energy companies are probably bracing for a rough ride.
That seems to be the general consensus among analysts. But it's important to remember that the renewable energy sector has been growing really fast in recent years, driven by falling costs and increasing demand for clean energy.
So even if government support goes down, market forces might still push the sector forward.
Right, it's not all about politics. Consumer demand, technological advancements, and global investments also play a role.
Okay, so the future of renewable energy under Trump is up in the air. But there are reasons to think it could keep growing even in a less supportive environment.
That's a fair assessment. It highlights the importance of looking beyond politics. You have to factor in those broader market trends and technological advancements that are shaping the energy sector.
It's a reminder that while politics can definitely influence the markets, it's not the only thing at play. Consumer demand, technological innovation, and global investment patterns all have a part in shaping how industries evolve.
Exactly. Market dynamics are complex and constantly changing, and savvy investors need to think about a wide range of factors before making decisions.
And that's what we're trying to do here. Give you the tools and knowledge to understand those complexities and make decisions that fit with your worldview.
Precisely.
Okay, let's shift gears again and talk tech. We already touched on the potential impacts on the big tech giants and those smaller tech companies. But what about the overall picture for this sector? How might the Trump trade affect the tech industry as a whole?
Both articles seem to think that the tech sector will keep growing under Trump. Although maybe not as fast as it has been lately, they point to the potential benefits of those lower corporate taxes.
Yeah.
But also concerns about trade wars and immigration restrictions, which could hurt the tech industry because it relies so much on global talent and trade.
So while lower taxes might be good for tech companies, other Trump policies could create some headwinds.
Right. It's not a clear-cut win or lose for tech. It's much more nuanced than that.
It's about understanding how different trends and events might come together to create both opportunities and challenges.
Exactly. The reality is that different segments of the tech sector will experience different impacts, depending on their size, their focus, and how they do business.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. I'm starting to see how this Trump trade is less about making broad pronouncements and more about understanding the nuances within each sector.
Exactly. It's about connecting the dots, understanding how political decisions, market dynamics, and individual company strategies all interact. And that's what we're here to help you do.
Well, Bloomberg Linea definitely threw in some curveballs when they talked about some surprising winners from Trump's win. For example, pharmaceutical companies. I wouldn't have immediately made that connection.
Yeah, it's a fascinating connection. It really speaks to the complexities we're talking about. Bloomberg Linea's prediction is rooted in Trump's emphasis on domestic production, particularly for essential goods.
Okay.
They point to the potential for increased domestic manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, which would obviously be a boon for U.S.-based pharma companies.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about this whole thing with prison companies potentially benefiting? That one really raised my eyebrows.
Yeah, that's definitely a controversial angle. Bloomberg Linea suggests that Trump's policies could lead to a greater reliance on private prisons, just like we saw during his first term. It's a stark reminder that market reactions aren't always black and white. They often reflect deeper societal trends and policy choices that have far-reaching consequences.
It definitely makes you stop and think about the bigger picture.
What?
Okay, so we've got banks potentially celebrating, oil and gas companies breathing a sigh of relief, clean energy folks facing some uncertainty, and tech companies navigating a mixed bag. What else is on the horizon?
Well, Bloomberg Linea threw out one more scenario that I found particularly thought-provoking, and it involves a major what if. What if Trump actually manages to broker peace in the Middle East and de-escalate the conflict in Ukraine?
Okay, now that would be a game changer.
Yeah.
But how would that impact the markets?
Well, they suggest that construction companies could see a major windfall from a post-conflict rebuilding boom, while arms manufacturers might see a decline. It's all very speculative, of course, but it underscores a crucial point about the interconnectedness of geopolitics in the markets. Foreign policy shifts, especially those as dramatic as this, can have a ripple effect across various sectors.
It's a reminder that we're not just looking at economic data in a vacuum. We have to consider the global political landscape and how it might influence market trends.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole Trump trade analysis so fascinating. It's not just about crunching numbers and looking at historical patterns. It's about understanding human behavior, political motivations, and the intricate interplay of local and global forces.
All right, so we've laid out the initial reactions, the potential winners and losers, and some of the key factors driving these trends. Where do we go from here?
Well, the next step is to dig deeper into these sectors, exploring the nuances and potential risks that lie beneath the surface. Remember, market trends are like icebergs. What you see on the surface is just a small fraction of the story. It's the hidden depths that really matter.
And that's where you come in, dear listener. We've given you the starting point, the initial lay of the land. Now it's your turn to dive deeper, to ask those critical questions, and to form your own conclusions about the potential impacts of this Trump trade. What stands out to you as the most significant takeaway from this initial analysis? What further questions are bubbling up in your mind? Because the Trump trade story is just beginning, and it's one you want to keep following closely.
It's a dynamic situation for sure.
All right, ready to keep digging?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's continue our deep dive and see what other insights we can uncover.
So it's another example of how the Trump trade could create winners and losers, even within the same sector.
And it really highlights those trade-offs you have to think about when it comes to environmental policy.
Relaxing regulations might help some industries in the short term, but what about those long-term consequences for the environment and public health?
It's about finding that balance between economic growth and protecting the environment. And that's what makes this debate so tricky. There's no easy answer. Different people are going to prioritize different things.
Right.
Some might focus on short-term economic gains, while others are more concerned with long-term sustainability and protecting the planet.
It's about having those tough conversations and finding solutions that work for everyone involved, not just those who benefit in the short run. Okay, I'm ready to explore another area where Trump's policies might have big economic impacts. Manufacturing. That's a sector he's talked about a lot as a key part of his economic plan.
Yeah, both Morningstar and Bloomberg Linea talk about the potential impacts of Trump's policies on manufacturing, but they focus on different aspects.
I remember his promises to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. and revitalize those industrial areas. But how might those tariffs affect businesses that rely on global supply chains?
That's a great point, and it's exactly what Bloomberg Linea brings up. They say those tariffs could actually raise costs for businesses that need imported parts.
Right.
And that could lead to job losses in those sectors.
So it's not as straightforward as it might seem at first.
Not at all.
Protectionist policies might help some manufacturing industries, but they could hurt others.
It's like squeezing a balloon. You push in one area and it bulges out in another.
Exactly. And it really highlights how interconnected the global economy is. What one country does can create ripple effects across borders, impacting businesses and workers all over the world.
Absolutely.
It reminds us that we need to think about those global impacts when we're looking at economic policies.
Definitely. We can't just focus on what's happening in one place.
We need to understand that we're all connected and that policies designed to help one country or industry can have unexpected consequences elsewhere. It's about finding solutions that benefit everyone, not just a select few.
You're absolutely right. It's about cooperation and finding common ground.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. From the environment to manufacturing, to how the Trump trade could impact the global economy. It's clear that this is a complicated issue with no simple solutions. But I'm feeling more confident in understanding the nuances and the potential consequences of these policies.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, to give you the information and insights to make sense of this complicated and always changing situation.
It's about understanding that the Trump trade isn't just about market trends. It reflects our values, our choices, and our responsibility to shape a more fair and sustainable future.
And it's recognizing that the story isn't over yet. The decisions we make today will determine what tomorrow's economy looks like.
So let's keep learning, keep questioning, and keep working to create a world where economic prosperity benefits everyone.
Absolutely. The Trump trade is just one chapter in a much larger story, and we all have a role to play in writing the ending.
And that ending depends on us understanding the issues, being willing to have those tough discussions, and working together to create a fair and prosperous world for everyone. So as I wrap up this deep dive into the Trump trade, We hope you've gained valuable insights and feel better equipped to understand this complex and ever-changing landscape. Remember, the story is still unfolding, and your understanding and engagement are crucial. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and keep exploring.